Happy Pride Month, everyone. And if you observe the holiday over the weekend, happy Juneteenth. We welcome you to today's DEI-focused conversation where we'll explore the impact of donation and transplantation within the LGTBQ plus community. My name is Deanna Fenton, Senior Manager of Educational Program Development here at the Alliance. As always, it's my pleasure to be here to kick off what I'm sure will be an incredibly valuable and dynamic discussion. Now, as we all know, showing respect is a critical component of delivering effective and compassionate patient care. Part of that starts with recognizing and appropriately addressing our patients and/or potential donors as they wish to be identified. Bearing that in mind, today we'll have an open and honest discussion about our understanding of gender and any personal biases we may have as a result of the heteronormative society we live in. If time permits, following our panel discussion, we'd like to encourage all of you to stay with us for an additional 30 minutes to participate in our interactive breakout discussions, where you'll all have an opportunity to engage in a more in-depth conversation about your own personal experiences and/or challenges. Our presenters will be available to you during that time to offer any additional insight or answer any questions you may have. Now, beyond that, we'd love to hear from you over the course of the discussion as well. So please take this moment to locate the chat feature so that you can submit any questions or comments that you may have in real time to actively engage with your colleagues and our panel. Additionally, for those of you who may be joining us as a group today, I'd like to ask that you take this opportunity to complete this poll to indicate approximately how many people have joined your group. Lastly, for those of you who may be interested in continuing education credits, please take note of the following slide. Following the conclusion of the program, you'll receive a detailed email from us with instructions on how to claim your credits. Now, with that said, I'd like to begin the program by welcoming our moderator, Tatiana Quiroga, Executive Director of Come Out with Pride Orlando and member of the Alliance's DEI Committee. Tatiana, thank you so much for being with us. At this point, I'll leave it to you to go ahead and get us started.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And happy Pride Month. The reason why June is so important in the LGBTQ plus community, because we mark this as the really start of the LGBTQ plus movement that happened in June. That's why you may see rainbows everywhere. And as it was shared earlier, my name is Tatiana Quiroga. My pronouns are she, ella. I am the Executive Director for Come Out with Pride, which is the Pride organization in Orlando, Florida. And we are one of the largest Pride celebrations in the Southeast. So I can talk to you about Pride. And one of the most important things that is part of this conversation when talking about Pride, and particularly Pride Month, is really the importance of allyship. We know that, allies are such a huge part of the LGBTQ plus movement. We really turn to our allies to be able to be in spaces that sometimes we don't have the privilege of being in. And we also turn to our allies to be able to help continue the conversations, sometimes question other folks who may not necessarily understand either the movement or the community or even allyship overall. So this really is, allyship has several different faces and several different ways for folks to show up. And, it is really a very important ongoing conversation. So please feel free. This is a safer space. Please take this opportunity to ask questions. This is the place that we want you to ask these questions that may feel sometimes a little bit tough, may feel a little bit uncomfortable, but this is the opportunity to do so. We've got incredible panelists who are joining us here today, and we're all here to be able to really continue this conversation and see how we can all move forward, really towards making this a better experience overall for particularly members of the LGBTQ plus community and our families. So again, please feel free to share questions in the chat. And, let's go ahead and kick off the conversation. So today we've got two incredible panelists with us that we are so, it is absolutely honor and pleasure to have them join us. So a little bit real quick about them. We've got Marissa Jimenez. And so we see that she's got a master's in social work, and she's a program manager of learning and development and a DEI consultant for Salesforce. So she has put together some slides to be able to kind of continue the conversation and give us a little bit of direction. And then we have the pleasure and honor of having Dr. Nicole Nylinger. And so she is also an associate professor of surgery and medical director. And most important, we'll be sharing a lot of her lived experience as an LGBTQ plus parent, so member of the community. And, also sharing about her family, which, really adds a completely different component to this conversation, both as being an LGBTQ plus parent and someone with a kiddo who's also in the community. So thank you so much to our panelists, and please feel free to jump in.
Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you for the introduction, and it's so great to be here today. And I love that you mentioned Pride Month and the rainbows. My 5-year-old said that her favorite color is rainbow, so I got to agree. So I hope that everyone had a beautiful weekend, in addition to all the Pride celebrations, that you celebrated Juneteenth and Father's Day. And like Tatiana said, today's discussion is going to focus on the LGBTQ plus community, but specifically on the transgender and non-binary community. We're going to discuss how we as medical care professionals can provide just the best care and support generally, and how we can continue to be allies. So because of our short time together, this presentation is really only an introduction to the larger discussion about gender identity. And I really encourage you to, if you haven't already, to supplement this learning with some of the resources we will touch on, including Gender Spectrum. Remember that, Gender Spectrum, a wonderful organization which supports medical professionals, educators, parents, and anyone who is navigating just a gender identity path. And they offer really great sessions. So before I continue, I just want to tell you who I am, and also a disclaimer. I see a lot of really familiar faces and names, and it gets me so excited to see people that I've worked with. And so for those of you that don't know me, I'm currently in Indigenous Ohlone land, now known as the Bay Area in California. I'm a clinical social worker by training. I have 17 years experience in the world of organ and tissue donation, primarily focusing on family care and learning and development. And academically, my graduate work focused on clinical social work and child and family therapy, specifically on gender identity and gender affirmation. Recently, I pivoted into the tech world. You saw that I work for Salesforce, where I continue my learning and development and diversity, equality, inclusivity work, but my passion and love remains in the field of saving lives through donation. So it's an honor to be here today. I'm cisgender female with the preferred pronouns of she, her. And for those of you that are bilingual, ella. I'm a spouse to a feminist and passionate social justice fighter. That's why I fell in love with him, honestly. And I'm the mother of a 5-year-old who's been raised to acknowledge our beautiful differences and to live outside the box, including the gender box. Because our topic is on gender identity, a short story. Until recently, when she verbalized that in fact she felt like a girl on the inside, as well as a girl on the outside, we largely use the pronouns they. You'll hear more on why age 4 and 5 is really a pivotal age for children and their gender identity soon. So you see this picture here on your screen. Our 5-year-old drew this picture. It's of her pediatrician and her pediatrician's wife. By the way, we have no idea if our pediatrician is married to a man or a woman, but our kids do so well not gendering people or making assumptions about what should be. It's just an example of that. I'm currently 8 months pregnant, and although we know the sex of our baby, we won't know their gender until they're old enough to tell us their gender identity. And disclaimer, I'm forever an ally of the trans and binary and LGBTQ plus community. However, this is not my personal story. I can never do the story justice. It's not my story to take. I can only speak about the experiences that I've observed from an academic and professional perspective. And that's why I'll do that for the next 15, 20 minutes. And after, we have a special personal testimonial in Dr. Nylinger's story. Our objectives, Tatiana summarized them for us, and so did Deanna. So I will start out by talking about defining gender identity and just discussing the core concepts related to gender affirmation, as well as talking about allyship. And then we will transition to the personal testimonial. So I want to level set for a moment and just acknowledge that we're all at different places in our learning. Give yourself permission to be okay, to be open, to be curious. Some concepts may be new, and that's also okay. There's a whole glossary for gender identification terms that is important for you to be familiar with. There's only 3 here. I mean, there's a multitude, dozens. There's only 3, which are the most common that you will hear today. So I encourage you to really go through and look at a gender identification glossary to learn more about how people identify in terms of their gender. Thank you. I see a congrats message on the chat. I appreciate that. All right, so transgender, which you will hear more often, is an umbrella term used to describe people whose true gender identity does not match the sex or the assigned birth sex. Cisgender is a person who identifies with the sex they were assigned at birth. So if they were born female, the sex of female, and they identify as female, they're considered cisgender. And gender fluid, also non-binary, is a person whose gender identity or gender expression is not fixed and shifts over time or depending on the situation. Okay, so why is this important? Because the trans community, including our children, just face higher rates of violence and higher rates of suicide. You can see some of the stats here. You can read them for yourself, excuse me. But the most important takeaway is that we're seeing attitudes change. So we're seeing people talk differently about gender norms, especially with the Gen Z. So people are really no longer accepting that we fit into a gender binary world. And what I mean by gender binary world is a boy-girl, a woman-man world. It's not a binary world. There are not only 2 genders, male or female, because we all fit into a gender that we identify as. So people are resisting a world where pink means girl and blue means boy. A gender non-conforming world where a person whose behavior or appearance does not conform to prevailing cultural and social expectations about what is appropriate to their gender, and that's not out of the ordinary. So even though it seems like right now, unfortunately, I mean, there was some news last night from the swimming organization that was not very good for the trans community. So even though it seems to be just deadly anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ legislation, society at large, as you can see here, are pushing for this cultural and generational change of acceptance. So you'll see here that today's young people have really just changed their understanding of gender. It's really positive for children, families, and organizations. So a 2015 poll of adults between ages of 18 and 34 found that the majority see gender as a spectrum. So if you think of a spectrum, there's one end over here, one end over here, and then the middle, rather than a man-woman binary. And there's another poll of millennials that found that 12% identify as transgender or gender non-conforming. There was a recent article in the New York Times that said that the states with the highest people that identify as transgender, interestingly enough, it's not California. It was Hawaii and New Mexico, and then California and Wisconsin. So that was a very interesting fact, but also just very heartwarming to see that there are other states, besides the ones that are usually moving forward progressively, that make people feel safe to identify as transgender. And I suspect that New Mexico and Hawaii, the reason their numbers are so high is because their indigenous culture there still promotes just a positive response to the 2 spirits. The 2 spirits meaning that it's a person who was born that identifies both as male and female. So it's really beautiful. There's some more research that says that people 56%, okay, 56, that's more than the majority of ages between 13 and 20 know someone who uses gender neutral pronouns. So gender neutral pronouns are pronouns that are such as they and them. And this is prompting businesses to change traditional gender-based marketing of products, such as removing things like pink and blue and in the toy aisles. All right, so let's move on to the 3 dimensions of gender. What is gender made up of? People tend to use the terms sex and gender interchangeably, but while they're connected, the 2 terms are not equivalent. So generally we assign a newborn sex as either male or female based on the baby's genitalia. And once sex is assigned, we presume the child's gender matches that. For some people, this is true, but for some people it's not. So we need to make sure that that our thoughts align with that there's not an assumption that because someone was born and assigned sex, that that's what they identify in terms of their gender. So there's 3 dimensions, and we'll go into them a little bit more. So the dimensions that you must consider when someone is thinking about their gender is their body. So our body, our experience of our own body, how society genders bodies, and how others interact with us based on our body. The second one is identity, and that's the name we use to convey our gender based on our deeply held internal sense of self. So identities typically fall into binary, which is man or woman, non-binary, which is genderqueer, gender fluid, or ungendered, which means agender or genderless. So those are the categories. Keep in mind that the meaning associated with a particular identity can vary among individuals using the same term. It's very complex. And a person's gender identity can correspond to or differ from the sex they were assigned at birth. So earlier on in my introduction, I said that my gender identity does correspond to the sex that I was assigned to. Social gender, how we present. So how we present our gender in the world and how individuals, society perceive or interact and try to shape our gender. So social genders include gender roles and expectations and how society uses those to try to enforce conformity to current gender norms. So take those 3 things. It's a person's comfort in their gender is related to the degree to which these 3 dimensions feel in harmony. So let me go on to the next slide. Before we continue into that notion, let's take a look at professional organizations that support the notion of harmony between our body, identity, and social gender. So many of you may be members of one or more, and may even use their clinical research to inform how you live your life. Each one of these organizations has published research or voiced support for the fact that gender is more than the physical assignment of our genitalia at birth, but rather a human being's gender is made up of a blend of the 3 dimensions: body, identity, and social gender. All right, so like I mentioned before, body. Most societies view sex as a binary concept with 2 rigidly fixed options, male or female, and that this is based on a person's reproductive anatomy, genitalia, and functions. But a binary view of sex fails to capture its complexity. And the reason that I'm going into this so in depth is because this is all very important to us in the world of organ and tissue donation. That not only are female and male bodies more complex than most of us realize, there are also bodies that fit into neither category. We're often taught that bodies have 1 or 2 forms of genitalia, but we have intersex traits that demonstrate that sex exists across a continuum of possibilities. So this level of naturally occurring variation just by itself should be enough to dispel the simplistic notion that there are just 2 sexes. Identity. So gender identity, that's the way we experience ourselves on the inside and the naming of our gender, even if it's different from our assigned sex at birth. And again, it can correspond to or differ. So understanding of our gender comes to most of us fairly early in life. According to American Academy of Pediatrics, a child by the age of 4 have a stable sense of their gender identity. And this is really a core concept of one's identity that comes from within each of us. So again, referencing my very wise 5-year-old, she likes to ask everyone, how do you really feel on the inside? Do you feel like a boy? Do you feel like a girl? Do you feel like neither? Or do you feel like both? So that's one of the first questions. And of course, because we have these conversations at home, but naturally she's come up with this question to just try to make people feel or understand that it's not binary. So gender identity is an inherent aspect of a person's makeup. We don't choose our gender, nor can we be made to change it. So the words someone uses to communicate their gender identity may change over time, because naming one's gender can be a complex and evolving matter. Keep that in mind, because I think that's one of the arguments that a lot of anti-trans legislation folks keep saying. The hard part about that is that we're provided limited language for gender. It might take a person or a teenager or your child quite some time to discover or create the language that best communicates their internal experience. That's why when we meet with a donor family who maybe does not accept the donor's gender identity because they have changed it or it's evolved over time, it's very natural. As our language evolves, as we grow older, our perception of ourselves also grows. It's evolving. It doesn't mean that their gender has changed, but rather that the words for it are shifting and they're learning about themselves. Okay, so we've already talked about gender binary and the idea that there's only 2 genders. And I mentioned that through human history, we know that many societies have seen and continue to see gender as a spectrum, and then it's not limited to 2 possibilities. So one last thing to think about is that what's really beautiful and something to keep in mind with your patients is that youth and young adults today no longer feel bound by the gender binary. Instead, they're establishing just that growing vocabulary for gender. And it's more than a series of words. It's just a shift in language, and it's very nuanced. And one example is also genderqueer. It's a term that's used both as an identity and as an umbrella term for non-binary identities. And they do not identify exclusively as masculine or feminine. It's just our evolution of language. It's really exciting. But it can also be confusing for some folks, since the terms can vary from person to person. And we have lastly, social. It's that third dimension that I talked about, which is the way we communicate our gender to others through things like our clothing, our hairstyles, and our mannerisms. And it also includes how individuals, communities perceive us and interact with us. And social genders include gender roles and expectations, and how society uses those to try to enforce conformity. So think about it. In terms of society, how practically everything is assigned a gender, like I mentioned before. The toys, the colors, the clothes. We begin to teach children about gender from the moment they're born. We force children to express their gender within narrow, stereotypical definitions of boy, girl. And they're communicated in every aspect of our life, from media, religion, culture, peers, school. How many have seen a gender reveal party where the baby's not born yet, but the family is assigning a gender based on the assigned sex? So in reality, I just heard it from someone the other day, these should really be called genitalia reveal parties, because that's exactly what they are. We know the assigned gender, the assigned sex. We don't know the gender identity until they can tell us. Remember, it's usually around 4 or 5, but it's so entrenched in our culture that it's difficult to imagine things. Okay, let me pause a moment and do a time check. think the last thing I want to say about this slide is that reinforce the fact that our gender norms are changing across societies and have changed over time. And that there's some cultures from around the world that have long held more nuanced understandings of gender, like the indigenous communities that I mentioned. In Australia, also, for example, they have non-binary individuals that are called brother boys and sister girls. And Mexico, the Mukes, and in the Americas as well. They're they're often grouped together under the umbrella term of two-spirit, like I mentioned. So there's just a rich diversity of gender. It's not a new thing, even though we're changing. It's not a new thing. It's always existed. Historians have traced the beginnings of gender binary rules to colonialism and Christianity. And thank you, Glenn. Yes, in Hawaii, it is Mahu. Again, the Mahu are celebrated, and maybe that's one of the reasons why there are more people that are willing to identify as trans, publicly identify. So I encourage you to do research on gender affirmations that date back to many centuries. All right, so gender congruence, that's the feeling of harmony in our gender. So when we experience comfort in our body as it relates to our gender, not just our assigned sex at birth. And again, I'm not going to go into this too much, but for some that might mean medical interventions for transition. For some that might mean absolutely no interventions. So just a call out. When we are an organ and tissue donation, or if we're a medical care provider, we have a patient that we think whose gender identity might not match their sex, they may not have had any medical interventions, but that doesn't change anything about how they identify. So keep in mind, some people are opting for none, and some people are opting for some. Naming our gender that adequately corresponds with our internal sense of who we are. Like using the appropriate pronouns. So some people wonder, well, how do I know? How do I know what pronouns people want if you can't see it on the Zoom call, for example? Well, then we ask, or we share ours. When you first introduce yourself to a patient, you can say, hi, my name is Marissa Jimenez, and my pronouns are she, her. What are yours? So another way of feeling harmony in our gender is that we can express ourselves through clothing, mannerisms, and just being seen consistently by others as we see ourselves. So it's an ongoing process. Some people find congruence is fairly simple. For others, it's a much more complex process. One more note on the medical interventions. The reason that we won't talk about the medical interventions too in depth here is because there's a tendency for a lot of people to reduce gender to bodies and reduce trans people to their body. So it's important to acknowledge that some don't want to change their bodies for many reasons, like I mentioned before. And also, let's not forget that cisgendered people are changing their bodies all the time. I mean, think about all the things that cisgender people do to their bodies. So they're changing their exterior to be consistent with their internal. So medical interventions, because it focuses on bodies and their bodies, and it just perpetuates the objectification of trans people. So very important to know that the trans community exists beyond their bodies. Here on the screen, you just see some common, some gender identity terms here that we've mentioned already. But this next slide, though, is what I really I'm excited to show you. So here is a 2-minute video on the effects of gender dysphoria. So gender dysphoria occurs when there isn't harmony between the 3 dimensions of body, gender identity, and social identity. So you've all probably heard this stat that more than 50% of trans youth are suicidal or have completed suicide. I mean, that's a really large number. When you think of 2 people, that's one of them. So gender dysphoria is incredibly dangerous, and that's why gender affirmation is so important. So let me show you this video that will speak for itself. Let me pause. Thumbs up if you can hear that. Okay. Okay.
It's about transgender issues. It's one being expressed through 2 people. One side's the boy, one side's the girl.
Melissa sits in the back of the classroom, afraid to speak up. She pulls awkwardly at her extra loose khaki cargo pants. She doesn't want the boys to notice her.
James finds himself in the back of the classroom. His baseball cap casts a shadow on his pimple-stained forehead. A wide shirt hangs on his broad shoulders. But no one ever noticed him. "Melissa," the teacher asks. And she says nothing because she is not here. And Melissa has never been here because Melissa is just some abstract jumble of syllables that doesn't fit her position. She's not what she seems. She doesn't want to have to explain to her mother for the 232nd time why she doesn't want to wear a dress to prom. Doesn't paint her face, it's because the whole body's painted on.
Melissa. James doesn't want to have to explain where he came from. Because with the exception of Melissa, he has been deemed an abstract reality by everyone.
All he wishes for is to get to wear a tuxedo to prom.
And Melissa has been tugging at breasts steadily growing for 3 years now. Been using duct tape to press them down and mold them more into pecs. She just wishes that people would understand that at birth, her genitals didn't know which way to grow. Mad at God who couldn't relay the message directly to her hormones that they should produce more testosterone. The only person who understands her is James. And they've been playmates since the age of 4, around the time girls noticed boys.
Boys notice girls.
See, James's family wanted daughters
Instead of sons.
and Melissa was always like that male beetle that everyone called a ladybug. Melissa, where is she? Sometimes she wishes she could rip the skin off her back. Every moment of every day she feels stuck in the flesh of a stranger. Melissa! And she stands to her feet, wanting to say, "I'm here, and I've been here since I was born." So when asking me if I'm a him or a her, because when you combine the 2 pronouns, you get HIR, here, and God combined the 2 genders and put me in this body transgendered. I'm here, so quit talking about me like I'm not here. James falls back into Melissa's skin, and the 2 comfort each other in their syncopated heartbeats, waiting for the day when Melissa can finally scrub off this made-up genetic makeup. When the teacher asks James, and he can say, "I'm here."
I'm here. That's all we really want our children to feel, that they're here and they're home and they're safe. I always need to catch my breath after I watch that video. So before we transition into some allyship practices, one final note, one final distinction to make. And that's the difference between gender and sexual orientation, which are often incorrectly conflated. And that happens a lot with some of this deadly legislation that is occurring with children. In actuality, gender and sexual orientation are 2 distinct but related aspects of self, excuse me. Gender is personal, how we see ourselves, while sexual orientation is interpreted as interpersonal, who we are physically, emotionally, and romantically attracted to. So why is it so important to distinguish between these 2 concepts? Because we confuse gender with sexual orientation. We're likely to make assumptions about a young person that have nothing to do with who they are. For example, when someone's gender expression is inconsistent with others' expectations, assumptions are frequently made about that person's sexual orientation. So the boy who loves to play princess is assumed to be gay, and the girl who buys clothes in the boys section and favors a short haircut may be assumed to be a lesbian. So these obviously could be incorrect conclusions. So what someone wears and how they act is about gender expression, and you cannot tell what a person's sexual orientation is by what they wear. Actually, for that matter, you can't know what their gender identity is either, unless they tell you. So our society's conflation of gender and sexual orientation can also interfere with the young person's ability to really understand and articulate the aspects of their own gender. I mean, take that video that you just saw. So it's not uncommon for a transgender or non-binary youth to wonder if they're gay or lesbian or any sexual orientation other than heterosexual before coming to a fuller realization of their gender identity. So how we come to understand our gender and sexual orientation and the choices we make to disclose and express these parts of ourselves are just two distinct paths. So remember that when we are working with patients or our own family members. Actually, call out family what is it called? I'm trying to think of a website now that is provided by San Francisco State University. And I think it's family affirmation. So it's how families can just really affirm the members, specifically the children in their family. All right. So allyship, closing it out. What is an ally? It's someone who has privilege, but chooses to stand for and with marginalized communities by taking tangible, ongoing actions to dismantle the systems of oppression. Again, an ally is someone who has privilege. In this conversation, it's someone who's cisgendered, like me, who was born with the same assigned sex at birth and identifies with the same identified gender. They're the same ones. But you choose to stand for and with marginalized communities by taking tangible, ongoing actions to dismantle systems of oppression. So to become an ally, you must work to develop empathy towards another group's challenges, finding ways to help carry the burden as your own. So the next few slides show how we, as cisgender folks, or as medical professions, those with that privilege, can put allyship into practice. So it's important to really acknowledge that in order to collapse oppressive systems in the US, it takes more than just the people who are most affected by social injustices to care. And it really takes more than one donation or a single day of protesting to make change happen. We understand that being an ally also is not about you or your feelings. You have every right to feel anger and horror and fear and guilt and sadness, but our job as an ally is to use those feelings to fuel your action. Expressing those feelings in hopes of gaining sympathy or comfort diminishes the issue itself, and it's not about centering the social justice around you, but around the people that are affected. How do you contribute to and how do you benefit from and tolerate oppressive systems? That's a question that we need to ask ourselves as allies, and it starts with deep reflection. So consider, do you fear for your life when you're taking evening walks in your neighborhood? Do you generally have positive interactions with the police? Have you ever been scared to enter a bathroom or a locker room? These are just a few examples of the beginning of deep reflection. There's an article by Peggy McIntosh, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. It's a powerful starting point for just learning and processing our privilege. There's also resources. Thank you, Glenn, for posting the SF State University Family Acceptance Project and the Gender Spectrum resource. Instead of asking marginalized groups to show us how to be a good ally, we need to put in the emotional labor. We need to do this by conducting research, seeking classes, joining activist groups, reading books and articles, watching films and documentaries, just to help us shed light on the oppressive systems in our society. And also accepting that being an ally is not supposed to be a comfortable and easy journey. Social injustices don't give marginalized groups a break when things get difficult. If you run into difficulties on your journey, if you use the wrong term, Just imagine what marginalized groups are facing day in and day out with systemic and ongoing injustices. So calling people out, it might not be easy to call out a boss, a best friend, a priest, a stranger, a mother-in-law, but the work of an ally is to take on the emotional labor of conducting uncomfortable conversations to get people to understand systems of oppression and when they're perpetuating those unjust ideals. So that's a really, really key, especially in the medical setting, where we're surrounded by colleagues and people. And then are you really fully ready to listen? The key is to listen to how people are feeling and what they need from you instead of prescribing your own authority on situations. Just have you gone beyond performing allyship for others, for social media? Posting on social media is great, but if you haven't done the internal work or taken any productive action to break down any oppressive systems internally, then you haven't really scratched the surface of what it means to be an ally. Here's a thread by Morel Harper, a resource that is also very helpful. Donating. It's important to volunteer, but have you donated to a social justice organization? Every donation counts. Committing yourself to just financially supporting social justice organizations on a regular basis is just really vital. Again, in addition to the volunteering your time, or even buying products or shopping at stores owned by marginalized groups. And then lastly, it's important for us as allies to understand that we might never know how it feels to be part of that oppressed groups that we're supporting. Just be passionate about the issues at hand. Don't, it's just, use your voice to amplify what marginalized people have said. Our job is to use our privilege to just share research and experiences. And it's important to realize that the voice of an ally works alongside the voices of an oppressed group, not above or beyond them. Here are the resources that I referenced throughout the presentation, and thank you, Glenn, for adding the others to the chat. You will get a copy of these slides after the presentation, but I just want to summarize that some of the points here, that gender diversity has existed throughout history and all over the world, and that one of the most fundamental aspects of a person's identity is gender, and it deeply influences every part of our lives. It's very important to be respectful when we meet a patient, respectful of their gender. We just validate every person's experience of self. We can develop greater acceptance for all, and just create greater inclusion for individuals who challenge the norms of gender, but it will create space for all individuals to more fully explore and express who they are. Some of us get to do it as children if we have a safe space, and some of us have to do it as adults. So I invite you to continue your learning. And I'm going to end here and introduce you to our next speaker. We have an amazing opportunity to just hear a testimonial that blends personal and professional. And I want to introduce you all to the great Dr. Nicole Nylinger, who I also proudly consider my colleague and my friend.
Great. Wow. Thank you, Marissa. Marissa, can you do the slides? You know, I become challenged. It's really an honor to be here and share our family story. I will say it's admittedly vulnerable. I think I know many of you on the call, which is terrific to see some familiar names. And probably you've heard me talk about topics related to organ donation before, but maybe not about topics as intimate and vulnerable as this one. I did a transplant fellowship at University of Wisconsin in 2007. And then when finishing that, I became the medical director for Donor Network West. That's how I began working with Glenn and Marissa in 2010. And in 2020, our family had the opportunity to move back to Madison and return to UW Health. Similar to what Marissa said, I will mention that Madison, where I live now, is a very liberal city in a somewhat divided state. And I politically at least, and I feel that. And also Madison and UW Health both are occupying ancestral Ho-Chunk Nation land. I use she, her pronouns, which you'll hear more about in this story. Fortunately, our hospital has this trustee badge that you can put on your faculty badge or whatever, which is actually kind of nice. So it's great to be here. And if you don't mind going to the next slide, Marissa. This is our experiences as an LGBTQ family. So I grew up in the Deep South. I grew up in a small town north of Atlanta, Georgia. This was in the late 70s, and gay and lesbian people were not, I don't think I knew any. I don't really think I knew much. But what I did know was that growing up, LGBT people were sort of seen as social deviants and targeted for violence. And a lot of those images that I had were negative or affiliated with some sort of violence. If you go to the next one. Also, the public opinion on LGBT people was not favorable. So on this timeline, if you look back even in the mid-90s, the dark green line is the number of people in the United States who do not think that people of the same sex should be able to be married. And it was 70% when I graduated from college in 1995. That's when I came out of the closet. And now that has changed. That has changed significantly, which is something I think most of us are very grateful for. But I think a consistent message that I heard growing up was that, if I wanted to be accepted by certain, the faith community, by community at large, I probably wouldn't be able to do that as my true self as a lesbian. If you go to the next one. I do want to say something important as we are in Pride Month, which is that I am a cisgendered white woman. I'm able-bodied. I think I'm aware that I have a tremendous amount of privilege. And as Marissa has mentioned before, I think it's really important to use that privilege to represent communities far more vulnerable than my own. And it's not lost on me that the acceptance that our family recognizes, if you want to use that term, it's certainly improved than it was. But as a result of the advocacy work, especially of the BIPOC queer community, such as in Stonewall, it's now been more than 50 years ago, and those marginalized communities. So I did want to recognize that as part of this talk. If you go to the next slide, Marissa. I again grew up hearing sort of an insult, that's so gay. This is sort of like playground talk, right? Which the equivalent I think is stupid or uncool. And after I came out, even still, this sometimes still happens today, I get obligatory heteronormative questions all the time about, do I have a boyfriend, or what does my husband do? Or I get a lot of questions too about, especially because I have a family with kids, like, how did that happen? Like, doesn't it require a cishet man and woman to have a family? So I get a lot of questions about that. And I try to acknowledge that and give people the benefit of the doubt that they're curious, but still it's something that it's a macroaggression that I think I face most days. So if you go on to the next one, so after I sort of came out and started recognizing who I was, I presented in a more androgynous or sort of masculine center way. I still do now. And that came with a whole new set of complications to navigate in terms of gender identity. I, again, identify as she, her. But even to this day, I have all sorts of bathroom experiences. And I'm sure I'm not the only one on this call that has this. So it usually looks something like this, like I'm an adult woman in my 40s. Especially if it's summer, I'm usually wearing like a trucker baseball hat and some long pair of shorts. And I enter the public women's bathroom only to experience some cisgendered woman sort of gasp or be startled. And I assume well-intended will start to say something, oh, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And now I've sort of heard this phrase enough that I know what's sort of coming. And to save both of us from embarrassment, I generally will sort of adjust my appearance or voice and try and respond to this well-intended person like, hey, I'm good, thanks. But I admittedly spend the next hour feeling kind of ashamed and embarrassed and wondering why, adult women can't what is it about me that doesn't fit right in an adult women's bathroom? I also routinely get called sir. I was telling Tatiana I was in Florida for my kids' spring break, and it was a record. I got called sir 8 times in the 7-day vacation. I got called sir when I was 8 months pregnant with twins. And this embarrassment sort of happens in front of my family, or even in front of my kids they're young, and they're often like, what is happening? You know, in their minds, this is just what mama looks like. And so they always have a lot of questions about, you know, why is this happening, and why does the world identify people into he and she? So if you go to the next one, I think it's Annie, right? Yes. So in 2011, this is Annie, my wife. She does pediatric hematology and oncology here at UW. She's a fierce donation advocate, by the way. Those of you who have worked with her know that. She is an advocate for end-of-life care in general. And we got married in 2011. It was the best, most memorable moment of my life, still to this day. But even on that day, I was told that while we were becoming married, this is in California, in the Bay Area, it wasn't a real marriage, because in 2011, even in liberal California, our marriage was not considered legal. If you go to the next one. So after sort of a plethora of heartbreaks and losses, here's me getting called sir, but not in that moment, but that was how big my abdomen was. I was pregnant with twins, and I delivered those twins in April of 2013. And a very nice woman from medical records came to ask us to complete some paperwork and fill some things out for some birth certificate forms. And of course, these forms had the word mother, father. I scratched out where it said father. I typed in mother again, and I wrote in Annie's name. This is my wife, who'd been there for the whole thing, right? All the fertility treatments, all the shots, the invasiveness, all the prodding, the whole thing. My wife, that is a pediatrician, that had picked out crib sheets and painted a nursery and, you know, done everything for me while I was pregnant. And this nice paperwork lady then told me that she was unable to put both of our names on the birth certificate of our children, that it wasn't up to her, but that this was the law. And this was just how it was going to be. So I exited the hospital with a birth certificate with only my name and the name of my kids, who have Annie's last name. We had a court-appointed person from Child and Family Services come to our house, interview us, and determine whether we were suitable to be parents to our own children. And we did a second parent adoption. Annie did that. They charged us about $5,000, and there was countless hours of paperwork. And the message, I think, that was clear was that one of othering and lesser than could not have been more clear, right? In that moment, like, we have so much privilege, right? To be able to, as 2 physicians, pay the legal fees and have someone come to the house and have it be a safe house that the world would identify as okay for kids. But this was an othering situation. And I think if you go to the next one, I might have our next. Yeah, so in 2013, the Obergefell decision came down. I don't know if some of you on this call understand the importance of that decision. And I think the importance that it stay, because that Supreme Court decision then allowed us to become married in the eyes of the law. So we got married again with our newborn twins in tow at San Francisco City Hall. This was the orange sign was actually on the wall at San Francisco City Hall when we got married. And, you know, I think there's no more profound union than marriage. And that's what Justice Kennedy said when he released the decision in that case. And, you know, it's under threat right now. And it's hard to think about what could happen if that decision is changed. But if you go to the next one and come back to gender, as soon as one of my twins was old enough to speak and dress himself, it became pretty clear that his gender identity did not match his sex at birth. So both of my twins were born as XX chromosome, identified sexually as girls. But walking the neighborhood one night, a crew of construction workers were working on a house, and they, at the time, misgendered him. At the time, he was identifying as girl Ryan. He was born with the name Ryan. And they said, now there's a big, strong 4-year-old guy who can work on our site, because the world is sexist and binary, and construction workers thought he was a boy. And sort of beaming at home 20 minutes later, he told me, you know, Mama, they got it right, that I'm a boy. Just like Marissa mentioned, he told us in no uncertain terms for the first time when he was 5 that he was a boy and that we'd been getting it wrong his whole life, and so had the whole rest of the universe. This was an insistent, persistent, consistent message from him, and he wanted to make sure that we got it right and told the school. So if you go to the next one, I think I have Ryan. Yep, this is Ryan. Gosh, he's in third now, so that's a last year picture. But the bathroom sort of misgendering continued to my then 6-year-old who got bullied and laughed at in the bathroom. And now you just cannot imagine how important it is to have a safe, single stall, gender neutral bathroom, which you never really think about this, how vital this is, until it becomes, something that you deal with every day. So he just wants to pee in peace. And that, that's how, when the single stall is not available, he uses the men's room, which is, we don't have a man in our family that's over 18 who can enter the men's room with him. So I have to send him, I'm at O'Hare or I'm at Camp Randall. You guys in Wisconsin know what I'm talking about. People have had a couple beers. I'm just holding my breath outside the men's room, waiting for my 6-year-old transgender son to come back out. So, I dream about the day when bathrooms aren't battlegrounds or people aren't terrified of 6-year-old trans kids, but that's been our lived experience with him. I think if you go to the next one, so this is our whole family. There's a lot of families like ours, and I think plenty of stories to be told. So I think there's a lot of space for those stories. And if you go, then I really think a lot about the donation community and how we can do better. So I think in the next one, I have a donor, right? Yeah. So as the donation community, I think about these issues. They're really front and center to me about how we can improve the experiences of LGBTQ families. And I think some of the ways we can do that are, first of all, to just stop the assumption that every family is heterosexual and cisgendered. If someone uses the term wife, if I tell you that Annie's my wife, like, she's my wife. We've been married 2 times. We've paid gazillions of dollars in order to have that. Like, she's not my partner. She's not my significant other. She's my wife. And I think that's something that we can do. And we can avoid the assumption that the person sitting next to two people at a table they can't make sense. They want to know if they should bring us 2 checks if we're having dinner with our family. Or maybe she is a friend or a sister, right? But I think we can ask questions like Marissa mentioned, and we can speak up and be allies to homophobic and transphobic jokes. More than half of trans kids have tried to take their own lives. They get bullied and rejected by the world. They get misgendered all the time. They get excluded from sports. There's just this huge thing with the swimming community. And I get it that a lot of parents of elite college athletes want their cisgender daughters to be able to win swim races, but I just want my transgender son to live to see college. And if there is a way we can do that as a world, I feel like that's important and we should do it. So if you go to the next one, I think it includes some work that I did at Donor Network West with Marissa and others, and I'm so grateful to all of you who contributed to this work. But the recommended language we came up with for donors, and I think this is so important, was that the organ procurement organization should recognize the donor and the patient's identified gender in communications, including in the electronic medical record, regardless of whether or not they've had surgery or are on hormones or all these other things. One thing is that we can disclose the patient's sex assigned at birth, and I would do it in that way in the donor workup, because there are a few instances. For instance, there's been a published study on heart recipients, and when the recipient identified sex is the same as the birth sex of the donor, there are some potential outcome differences. So in order to ensure that centers are aware of that when they're making organ acceptance offers, I think it's fair to put in the donor highlights the person's assigned sex at birth was whatever. But otherwise, honoring their gender, I think it's important. I think we're called to be stewards of gifts, and we have to get it right as a donation community. I have an example, and I think there's 2 more slides. And I think if you go to the next one, yeah, this was so profound to me because, I'm terrified, of course, having a trans kid, that it's not lost on me how many of these kids don't even make it to college. But a lot of these kids die by violence or by self-injury, and a lot of them die and they give the ultimate gift as donors, and they've spent their whole life trying to be seen for who they are. And then in death, they get misgendered. So this is Leela. This was a suicide note that she was 16, I want to say. And this is a suicide note that is heartbreaking that she left on social media, saying, you know, I feel like a girl trapped in a boy's body. I felt that way ever since I was 4. I never knew there was a word. When I became a teenager, I learned what transgender meant. I cried happiness. But then there's some explanation here about explaining this to the world, who reacted negatively and said this was just a phase and God doesn't make mistakes. And this was the last publication she had. She died by a self-inflicted death at 16. And on the next slide, this is the post-mortem statement from her parents. It's misgendered her in death and said, "We love Joshua very much and are devastated by his death. We have no desire to enter into a political storm or debate with people who did not know him." This case was really profound to me. And I know in our world, we see a lot of donors who are transgender. And I just think a big thing we can do as a community is to get it right. These are the people whose gift makes it all possible. And I think this is our obligation, honestly. I'm happy to do any questions. I think we're over time, but am I right, Marissa? This is my last slide. Yes. Oh, there's our family at Lake Superior a couple of years ago. And this is my contact information for anyone who has a question they don't want to ask you. And I'm grateful to be here. Thank you.
Tatiana, you're muted.
Yep. Okay, there you go. You figured I would have gotten used to Zoom by now, but thank you so much for both of our panelists. What I absolutely just really greatly appreciated about this conversation is that it really was a beautiful balance between educational and then the personal testimony from both of you to really share your lived experience. And, you know, it's Marissa, clearly you have spent so much time educating yourself as an LGBTQ plus ally, which is just absolutely a dream as somebody who identifies as a queer Latina, to have someone such as yourself that takes such time and devotion and passion into, you know, really learning your voice, knowing the history, knowing all of that. So if you could just, clearly you're the bar of what an ally best case scenario could look like, but for someone who may be new to being an ally, could you share some just like baby steps that folks can kind of start off with?
Thanks for that, Tatiana. That's so special coming from you. Yes, some baby steps. I think it all starts with empathy. We just never know what each other is experiencing. We never know what we're going to run across with our children, with our family members, with our brothers and sisters, our siblings. We don't know. So it's important to just put ourselves in other people's shoes, be empathetic, even if we don't understand. Just try to understand, especially given for gender identity, given that stat about 50% of trans kids attempt suicide. If you're a parent, listen to your young child. If you don't have the answers, maybe consult with someone who does. There's a study that shows, and I'll close with this, there's a study that shows that when parents are not responding to a child's gender affirmation or gender dysphoria, a child who is 4 or 5 will go to their kindergarten teacher. So it's been found that kindergarten teachers, if the parents are not receptive, are the ones who are walking our children through that path of gender affirmation. So empathy.
Awesome. Thank you. And Nicole, thank you so much for sharing so much of your personal and your family's story. I feel like our journeys were very paralleled. And so many different ways of even, you know, I came out in 96. And so totally there with you, remembering, you know, Ellen's toaster oven, you know, big thing. And so even too much, there's a lot of aligning even in our families. My wife, who identifies as butch and appears as non-binary, was our bio and gestational carrier and completely got misgendered. Also entering a restroom at 9 months pregnant. So completely understand. And then I had to do a second parent adoption on both of our kiddos too. And like you shared, Florida being Florida, you saw, you know, some of the struggles that we have so much. And so obviously you identify as someone who is in the community, but then also you're an ally to the trans community. Can you kind of break that down a little bit for folks who may think it's kind of one and the same?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that when Ryan, you know, expressed that he was trans to us, for some reason in my mind, I thought it would be easier or that I would be good at it because I'd been in the gay community for 20 years when that happened. But I do think there is a different, it's different experience. I'm cisgendered, so while I get misgendered, I don't have near the same vulnerabilities that Ryan does. So I think that it's important again, and Marissa did such a good job, both of you have, of mentioning this, like being an ally is so important and so much about like just recognizing your own privilege and not making the conversation about you. So I think I have a different, you know, in the gay community, I'm a representative and representation matters. And in the trans community, I'm an ally, and I can just use my cisgender privilege to speak up for Ryan and to, you know, to see him and to do what I can to sort of minimize the vulnerabilities and the risk and the fear that he has.
Thank you. And also too, I know that both of you kind of mentioned this, and then obviously I just shared, you know, that I'm a Latina. So we have folks clearly in the community who are part of intersections. And so we know that, you know, Nicole, like you mentioned, you know, Black and brown trans women were such a pivotal part of our history and really kicking off the movement. You know, and this is a question to either of you too, would either of you like to share a little bit more of how there may be a little bit of there's a varied experience when it comes to folks living in intersections and having to deal with also being in the LGBTQ plus community?
I mean, Marissa's more of an expert on this than me. I think, you know, when I see a trans woman of color, I'm like, oh, like, because the level of vulnerabilities and the level of like fear that person sees is in so many levels. It's, you know, I think about my own experience, what I have, you know, being a lesbian, in so many other ways I have societal privilege, and I just can't imagine compounding it.
Most definitely.
Yeah, I'll do a quick addition to that. That was perfect. I think that in addition to some of the just the health disparities and the suicide rates that the trans folks are faced with, there is an additional minority stress impacts. And so what that means is that the additional stress that members of marginalized groups experience because of prejudice and discrimination that they face. So it's compounded when that person also identifies as non-binary or transgender. And so all of those things, racism, poverty, sexism, transphobia, just rigid gender norms are compounded when a person, there's that intersectionality. They are Latino, transgender, immigrant, all of those things are just have increased.
Mm-hmm. And I know, Marissa, you and I have talked about before, especially with like the Latino culture and so much of where we think, you know, in the white culture here in the United States, so much like you had shared in your presentation that, you know, gendering starts from even before birth. We look at pink and blue, but even in the Spanish language, everything is gendered down to water even has a gender. So much of that gendering is even to the core of our culture and even to the core of our language. And so, you know, kind of tying back to what you were saying about those of us who live in intersections, that's where, you know, the increased challenges even happen. And then that, you know, also where our families of origin are going to be coming to and having their own challenges lots of times of when we see folks in the community.
Exactly. Familial rejection, family challenges, but in addition to that, the more marginalized identities, the greater possibility of violence and discrimination against that person.
Yes, definitely. And folks, feel free to please put some questions in the chat box. Clearly, we have two incredible panelists. You know, or, you know, as Deanna said, please feel free to unmute yourself. And as we wait for folks to do that, I would love to kind of touch upon the fact that I know a lot of this conversation, we talked about trans youth. And, you know, 4-year-olds starting to even recognize, you know, their own identity and such. But do you all feel that conversation can also apply to folks later on in life who maybe come out later on or have the same kind of risk factors, especially in the trans and non-binary community?
I mean, I do. A lot of trans adults that I know, there was not even words for being able to be trans. And, you know, as I try and become an ally now, I just see how hard it was to go so many years without even languaging. Like nobody even knew the word transgender, and how much more just body image challenges a lot of folks have. I'm so grateful that Ryan is 5, when he was 5, now he's 9, but that there are things we can do to align his body more with his gender, and just how, even at a young age, already at 9, just how important those things are for him. And adults coming out as translator in life, how hard it is for them, and how much sort of how much suffering they expressed to me that they felt for so many years, just being in a body that doesn't match.
And I also think too, it's, you know, what you were saying also, Nicole, is, you know, really acknowledging that, you know, the coming out process is a journey. And so it doesn't just happen, you know, one time, you know, in our life. It's one of those that you almost have to come out almost every day, depending on the circumstances, depending on life's experiences. And so, you know, folks that I know who are in the trans and non-binary community that come out later in life, especially of, you know, older generations, like you were saying, lots of times there wasn't the language. They were either stuck in situations. And now a lot of the things that I see in the larger community is folks trying to wrap their mind around the fact that, and Marissa, you talked about this, of not having to be like binary, where it's like, okay, they were, you know, assigned, you know, their gender at birth, but now they're trying to totally transition, and that there is that area where folks are just simply, they just are, and they're not trying to pass, which is a word that, you know, we hear, or at least have heard quite a bit of folks, you know, doing all their efforts of just trying to pass. Some folks, that's not their goal. And Marissa, you talked about that, you know, in your slides. Is there anything else that you had wanted to add to that?
Sorry about that, Tatiana. I was multitasking and looking at the question right before by Michael Palmisano. So can you ask your question again, please?
Oh, I was just simply saying, like, in your presentation, you had talked about the fact that, you know, there's non-binary, and that we know that lots of the way that our mind works has been very binary, right? So some folks wrap their mind around the fact that they're like, okay, I understand trans, you just want to go from here to there. But there are some folks that don't want to pass. They are non-binary, and being trans doesn't mean having to completely, you know, go through the entire process of a transition. And so just seeing if there is, you know, especially when we're talking about, you know, folks who are older, you know, and just glad that they came out, or just still trying to wrap their mind around their own situation.
Exactly. So again, it goes back to that conversation of the 3 dimensions of gender, you know, that identity, the body, the identity, and the social. And there are some people that are completely, even though they identify as maybe trans or neither or both, they do not feel like they need to change any part of their body or their social presentation to feel congruent with their gender identity. There's some publications that indicate that this is becoming a little bit more frequent with the Gen Z generation. In fact, even the Gen Z generation feels so like forward thinking about gender that the pronouns, they even feel like pronoun assignment is like, I mean, that's like a given. It's not such a big deal. So yes, I feel like we are moving to a place where people might feel like they need to make to transition, they need to do it physically to their identified gender. There's a growing group of people who do not. And I want to take a moment to answer Michael Palmisano's question about any organizations that gather to raise awareness and strive to change laws affecting the LGBTQIA+ population in regards to donation. And Tatiana and Nicole, you can speak to this as well, but I am not familiar of a specific donation organization, but I do know that there are countless number of individuals at individual OPOs making strides forward about some of those, for example, some of those questions in the donor assessment questionnaire that seem a little antiquated, or really challenging why those questions are there. So, I mean, I personally know Tomiko Panzella and Stacy McKean, who was part of the larger UNOS organization that was trying to just advocate for the LGBTQIA+ donors. But I think this is probably a call to action to maybe create a national, international organization that does raise awareness and strive to make a movement. But Nicole, am I missing anything?
No, I think you're the work that I've lobbied for on this front has been admittedly fragmented. Like, I'll go to one organization and say, we need to think about why we're classifying monogamous gay men who've been in marriage for 15 years as PHS risk. And then it's a different organization to say, why are the words sex and gender being used interchangeably on UNET or something, or why is it being used interchangeably on iTransplant? Like, all of those types, it's fragmented. I think it would be terrific to have a centralized way, to address some of these issues. I find people to be open when I say, like, we need to get this right for donors upon their death, but then who owns it has been challenging, I have found. There's a good question. I knew this is a good question. And it's kind of two people asked this in the chat about how do you honor someone's chosen gender and name when their family doesn't? And I was talking about this with my wife because she does pediatrics, and they face this in living kids. So the living kids are coming into their pediatrician with my gender name is this, and their parents, who's right there at the visit with them, are like, nope. and they keep using the dead name and the dead gender. So she was telling me that like within the peds community as well, like this is a challenging thing to navigate. And typically if the child is old enough, how they're navigating it is having individualized conversations with the child at this part of the meeting. Could you step outside, parent? But also I think it's what we have to do in donation is sort of bring it to the surface. And I don't think there's any reason to get an argument with a grieving family. Like, I don't love that either. But by saying like, we're stewards of this donation gift, your person has become a donor under this name and gender, and we want to honor in their death their life as they chose to live it. Like, I feel like our obligation is to donors. That's true in first person authorization also. Like, they are what makes this possible. And I feel like that's our ethical obligation. And I think in front of families that don't accept it, it can be admittedly challenging. And, you know, when you're doing the jury and you say, what was her? And they say his, you know, it can be sort of challenging. But I guess a statement of like, this is an awkward situation, admittedly, and we're just trying to honor what we know of the donor's gender and name. But you've done this, right? You've done this. Marissa's talked to donor families a lot in this situation. And do you have tips on how you navigated it?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us have been in a similar situation, whether it's behind the scenes doing workup or with the family. I think the key is to create an organizational policy, to start out from there. What, as an OPO, what is our obligation as an OPO? Is it to honor the gender identity of every single donor, every single patient, while considering some of the other medical or allocation implications? If that's in your policy, then your coordinators will walk into a room confidently to provide that family support. If the family rejects the donor's gender identification, then we're obviously, like Nicole said, we're not going to argue or fight an already escalated situation, but rather we're going to communicate what our stance is. It is our practice, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, to honor the patient's chosen name the same way we're honoring his first person authorization. Now, of course, if there is additional resistance, and that becomes a point of contention, because we know that families in crisis sometimes will latch onto something because they're so devastated, then we can move towards a more neutral language so that we are honoring the donor. So instead of a specific pronoun, she or he, we might use more neutral they. Did they have a private practitioner or private medical practitioner? Did they have any history of such and such? Did they? But of course, you are in that situation with a family in crisis, so you make the determination. But having an organizational policy, written policy, will give your coordinators a lot more confidence to walk into the room.
Wonderful. Well, I know that we unfortunately are leaving a couple questions still in chat, but trying to be mindful of time. Was there anybody who would like to unmute and do a quick question? No? All right. Well, again, thank you so much to our incredible panelists. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. And as everyone can see, this is an ongoing conversation. And one to remember when, you know, being an ally to anyone in a marginalized community, that there's no experts. There's always constant learning. There's always constant conversation. And, you know, as Marissa said, we're really trying to just simply have empathy for each other. As Nicole shared, we, you know, are all human beings who are just simply going through that human lived experience. And, you know, it's always something that is going to be a learning point. So again, thank you so much for being here with us today. It was a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.